Oh, thanks so much, Matt. And thanks for the thumbs up, Lorraine. It's awesome to see so many of my amazing colleagues and contacts in this Zoom room here this morning. I just saw Terry Wills on the call here. We had an incredible opportunity to work together with Jennifer Miller and Smiths Falls and other partners across workforce development and employment on a conference last year in May. And so it's really great to see the Lanark partners and some stretching into Leeds Grenville here on this call. So thank you so much for the intro. Yes, that's a long bio, and I didn't supply it, so I'm glad they found it. But certainly, my role here today is sort of twofold in the sense that yes, I am here representing the Community Settlement Initiative, and my goal today is to provide you with this real snapshot on how we can be extraordinarily inclusive when we carry out some of our recruiting and hiring. But also, I am an employer, and I am an employer in a rural area, and I deeply care about our small communities and how we can grow and really position ourselves as people are moving out of urban areas into rural places, how we can position ourselves as one of the most attractive places in Ontario to live and work. And so I'm just so delighted to be invited here today by the Work Matters team, and as well my dear partners at the Local Immigration Partnership and also the labor market group of Renfrew and Lanark. I'd also like to make note that Laura Julian, a member of my team, is on this call today. She is my counterpart at the Community Settlement Initiative and has a wealth of knowledge and is supporting me in the training delivery over the next couple of months as we wrap up our project. So thank you so much for all of those intros. And basically my goal here today is to help emphasize what is required to understand within some of the recommendations that Stephen made this morning. You know, if there's anything that I want you to hear about his presentation this morning is that we are in a candidate market, okay? There's a very different reality going on in workforce development in rural places and across Canada, where no longer when we put up job ads are we getting a flood of resumes or a flood of applications to pick through. In fact, some of the employers I work with tell me that they get 0 responses to job ads at times. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that this idea of branding as an employer, positioning yourself in the marketplace, the reason for all of those things is because the candidate now has the control of the market. And so I want to be clear about what that means. So the cleanest example is to think about real estate, right? When the seller has control of the market, similar to what's happening right now, what happens is that buyers have to make really excellent pitches to the seller to be the one that's selected. And in fact, what we're seeing across the region is an inflation of housing prices because of that reality. So if we correlate that theme to employment, it's exactly the same. You're the buyer. And so you have to be in a position to attract that sale, to attract that candidate, and also understand that this means further intentional work, incentives, and other things like great branding and great programs and personal connections that will be able to close that deal. Okay, so this is the whole idea behind the workshops today. But my little role here for the next hour or so is to introduce you to how bias and different ways of thinking and seeing the world do deeply affect our ability to perform in some of these categories that Stephen so carefully pointed out. And thank you to Marilyn for your points in the chat earlier about bias in job advertising and recruiting. I want to give one clean example about why this is so important. And then we're going to go through a couple of fun activities to try and paint some pictures on how we can become more aware and proactive with respect to inclusive hiring and recruitment. So I'm not sure if any of you are aware, but there was a study done by the University of Toronto in partnership with York University in the GTA that was called The Power of a Name. This study, basically, in a nutshell, they looked at 10,000 job opportunities in the GTA, and they wrote 10,000 resumes and cover letters to match exactly those job opportunities. They were fake. They were sort of fabricated people and credentials. And so what they did was they released 10,000 of these exacting match resumes and cover letters to these opportunities with Anglo-Saxon names. So the classic John Smiths, Jane Does, Brittany Taylors of the world. And then they did the same thing with Arabic names. And then they did the exact same thing with Mandarin names or Chinese names. And so the same resumes, the same credentials, the same language was reproduced on the resumes and cover letters, but the names were the only things that were changed. And what they learned was that all 10,000 of the resumes with Anglo-Saxon names were invited for interviews. Then this dropped to approximately 60 to 65% capture for Mandarin names, and then it dropped into the 40s for Arabic names. So when we look at these results, what this is telling us is that sometimes that packaging or the sort of view of difference or something I may not have seen before or do not understand or do not feel comfortable pronouncing, there may be many reasons, but this difference is actually what's causing that candidate to not even be seen as a valid fit or opportunity for the employer, for the recruiter. And so this is a natural human condition that we call unconscious bias. And so one of the critical things that we must understand as players in the world of recruiting and hiring and supporting candidates is that we also must understand our own positioning with respect to difference. So one of the really neat experiments that I was also able to read about is called Red Shoe, Brown Shoe. And this is a little story I'd like to tell you to illustrate how powerful our brains are with respect to detecting threat. So back in the day, if you were collecting water from a riverside as a village dweller, and you looked up across on the other side of the bank of the river and saw a mountain lion, your brain is designed to detect that threat and to, in fact, respond with a safety response of run or get out of that situation. And so when we're at the riverside every day collecting water, if the mountain lion shows up in our observation, immediately we're going into threat detection mode because of the difference and the reality of that threat. So now in modern society, our brains are tricking us a little bit in the sense of we are not being chased down by mountain lions, but we might be detecting difference as threat. So the red shoe, brown shoe experiment is so fun. It's written about in this book that I absolutely love, which I recommend to all employers that I work with, which is called The Power of Moments by Chip and Dan Heath. This book is all about engineering powerful moments with your people to really start to create some of those connections. They talk about John Deere and how they have one of the best employee orientation days possible. But one of the stories in here is about an experiment called Red Shoe, Brown Shoe. So what they did was they threw up, they had an audience and they threw up a slide of a sort of plain brown shoe, an everyday loafer, let's call it. And there was, some instructions provided that said, examine the shoe, take a look at the stitching, the sole, the laces, all the fabrics, everything like that. Take a look at that shoe, examine it while the slide is up. And then they put up another slide after a specific period of time, and then another one. And it was just brown shoe after brown shoe after brown shoe. Okay. And every single time the slides came up, the same directions were given. Analyze the shoe, take a look at everything. And then all of a sudden they threw up a red patent leather stiletto. And they said, okay, examine the shoe, same instructions, take a look at the stitching, take a look at the sole, all of those things. And then they went back to good old brown shoes and they just kept flipping those slides up. So at the end of the experiment, they asked the audience, what do you think that the slides of the red shoe was up for less or more time than the individual slides of the brown shoes? And nearly everyone in the audience that they studied responded that the red shoe had been on the screen for a longer period of time than individually the brown shoe slides. And in fact, the brown shoe slides had been up for 20 seconds each and the red shoe for 30. So, oh, sorry, the other way around. The brown shoes had been up for 30 and the red shoe for only 20. And so what this reveals to us is that when difference is presented in a normative environment, so the norm repeating behavior, the repeating observation is the brown shoe, and the difference was the red shoe. And so not only are we noticing it more and really having a brain pattern around that difference, but we focus on it and we end up centering on it, so much so that it feels like we spend more time observing those things in life. So this has a positive and a negative effect. What it does when they use the information in this book, they talk about how the positive effect is that when you make a special day for your employee or do something very special that's out of the norm, that they will remember that and refer to that when the days are tough. But the other side of this reality is that when difference is perceived as negative, we will also sit in that negativity, and it's possible that we might not move beyond that. Right? So we might see that Arabic name at the top of the resume, see difference, not know how to pronounce that name or be comfortable with sort of the whole idea of the cultural needs or the things that might come along with hiring someone of difference, someone outside of the cultural norms. And then we just sit there and stay there. And that is very human and actually quite expected and natural. And so what I want to do today is a fun experiment with you all. And I realize there will be people in this room who have seen this video. It was a viral video, so it's very possible you've seen it before. And it's also possible that you know the secret. So please no spoilers, but this is an opportunity for you to use the chat. And so please chime in as we go through this debrief, because it's really important that we all understand that this reality of threat detection, difference detection is human. This is absolutely normal, natural, and expected. So what we talk about today is a human condition, and there is no blame for any answers or any feedback that you provide in the chat, and I welcome it. So I am just going to flip into a screen share here to pull up this really fun video, and we're going to just take a look at it. So everybody should be able to see a BBC News screen. Can I just get a nod from Laura to just confirm that that's up? Thank you so much. All right. Is it filling your screen, Laura? Thank you. All right, here we go.
Scandals happen all the time. The question is, how do democracies respond to those scandals?
And what will it mean for the wider region? I think one of your children has just walked in. I mean, shifting sands in the region. Do you think relations with the North may change?
I would be surprised if they do. My apologies.
What's this going to mean for the region?
My apologies. South Korea's policy choices on North Korea have been severely limited in the last 6 months.
Okay, I realize we're all on mute, but that's funny, right? I love this video. Thank you, Charlene, for saying that. It's such a funny video. This came out a few years ago, but for anyone that wasn't able to see or hear it, basically it's a BBC international correspondent. They're on national news. He's in his bedroom. This is like so our normal, right? These Zoom realities of like what's happening in the background. I was on a call the other day where I could hear a dog snoring. in the background, which is so funny. But even we're experiencing that in the news cycle today about the counselor that got in his car and started texting and driving during a council meeting. So that's really interesting coming forward. But the whole idea of this video is so simple. So I have one question to pose to the audience, and there is absolutely zero blame or ownership judgment on what you answer, but feel free to populate in the chat whether or not you think the woman in the scene was the nanny or the mother. And go ahead and put your responses. If you know the truth, please, again, do not spill the tea. Okay, no spoilers. So give me your guesses. Okay, even if you want to send them to me privately, that's fine. Just give me your guesses. Okay. Nanny, 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 mother, nanny, mom, mother, mother, mother. So a huge divide here. There's half the group assumed nanny, but think it's a mom. Yes. Okay. On and on and on. Okay. So the room is divided. And this is usually what happens when I send this video out. It's like 50-50. Okay. Kind of thing. So that's fair. Okay. So it's fair that thank you, Liz. I think it's really fair to say, and I know I'm giving you a polarized question here, nanny versus mommy, but I think this really interesting analysis, this is where it gets really interesting. So anyone who answered nanny, I want you to just explain to me why. If anyone wants to unmute and chime in, by the way, just raise your hand or put up an emoji or something, and we'll do that, or just go ahead if I don't see it. So why would what is telling you about the scene? What from the scene is telling you or suggesting to you that she might be the nanny? Go ahead and throw a few things in the chat, or if you want to unmute and speak up, that's absolutely welcome. The way she closed the door. Okay, thank you so much, Daniel. So the idea of closing the door was this, the body language, right, was really like low, and she kind of like, cowered away and pulled the door closed while kind of crawling out of the room. Okay, so that's what I observed. Thanks. She looked younger than he did. Okay, so the age, the potential age of this woman, for sure. Okay, thank you. The idea of an almond-shaped eye or dark hair, suggesting that she might be of sort of Asian country of origin. This is broad brushstrokes. The way she interacted with the kids. Okay, so I hear this a lot about, the rushedness of the response, or like the hesitation. She didn't talk. Okay, so she didn't speak up or use her voice. So what we're starting...
Chéla?
Yeah, go ahead.
I raised my hand, but it doesn't seem to be working.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
No, that's okay. So I'm butting in. As a mom, if she's the mother or the nanny, you would want she's trying to stay out of the camera angle and be discreet. So I don't know that determines who she is.
No.
And cultural differences, if she is the mom, might allow for that, what we might perceive as a bow of respect as she goes out the door as well. So we don't really know who she is.
That's the whole idea of this exercise. Thank you so much.
Well,
yes, that's the whole point. No, I'm so glad you brought this up, because that's the point of this exercise, is to examine assumption, right? Because that's exactly what's happening here, is that we're using observation of a 32-second video to make a ton of conclusions, right? That we're drawing conclusions live in our brain when we observe the world, right? So, and the reality is that whatever we discuss here is absolutely assumptive unless we know the truth and saw the news cycle follow up about what happened here. So thank you so much for saying those things, because that's exactly what we're doing here, is recognizing that we are going to have this natural human mountain lion moment of like looking upon something and saying, yes, okay, that's different. I'm not sure what's happening here, but this is what I've seen before and how I'm going to interpret it. Okay, so when I see things in the chat here about she shied away, she didn't talk, she looked like she might get in trouble. Okay, so depending on your experience, you may connect that with fear of employment loss, or you may connect that with a sensation of with your husband, right? So maybe in this situation, depending on your lived experience, in your relationship with your spouse or partner, you might have said, well, she has to be the nanny because I would just speak up and enter the room, with posture and gently and hi, on the camera and remove the children, right? If you had that type of norm in your life as a spouse. You also might have seen in television, media, or in the world of entertainment or wherever, public information channels, you may have seen representations of Asian nannies, right? You also may have seen it in your community more often because, in fact, Canada has a stream called Live-In Caregiver directly from the Philippines. And so there are a large number of Filipino newcomers who serve in nanny and caregiving roles. So this is maybe an image you've seen before. So no matter what, if you felt she was the nanny or the mom, there are reasons why. Okay, there are reasons why you think that way. And thank you for reiterating that again, Liz, in the chat, is that we must examine those conclusions, right? We taste it and we swallow it and we conclude what it is in our mouth. But oftentimes the intuition is just not oftentimes, all the time, your intuitive response is based on what you saw before. Okay, so what I've seen before is what I expect to see now. Okay, so this is called unconscious bias. The whole idea here is that we cannot take blame for having unconscious bias. This is human. It's an absolutely natural part of the way we interpret the world. It's there so that we can find out that mountain lions might kill us. But in today's context, the most critical thing is acknowledging the unconscious bias, detecting it, uncovering it by slowing down and questioning our assumptions, and then moving towards a conscious bias. Okay, because with consciousness of our own individual bias, we are then able to address it and develop systems to monitor for it. Okay, so what we have done, for example, here is the idea of the power of the name study. Okay, there is an unconscious bias that when I'm reading a name I may not be able to pronounce or am familiar with, that I might go right past that candidate because of my own inability to, see the value beyond that challenge or the difference. And then if I can say, oh, right, I'm aware that I'm discrediting certain candidates because they don't look like me or speak like me or have the same education as me or whatever it is that I'm looking for, because I want to see what I've seen before. If we can then say, okay, I'm aware of this, then now I can look at how to intercept. Okay, so we have to see bias as a flame that may not be extinguished. It is a human condition. It is the way that your brain is wired. And so now we have to create systems, structures, processes, and tools to be able to address it and monitor for it, because we can't blow it out. We may not extinguish the flame of bias, but we can look upon the light and we can also watch how it burns. And this whole idea of seeing how the flame of the candle impacts the situation, that's the goal here. That's absolutely the goal, okay? Is moving beyond that and not allowing that to be a barrier to achieving the recruiting that we need. And so I'm going to show you another short video now that really, it's developed by the Royal Society, and the particular branch of this corporation that's done this one is from the UK. It's fantastic. It's something that's available on YouTube and also at the Royal Society's website. But I want to show it to you today because they do such an excellent job at illustrating what I've just showcased here with this example. We're good to go. Thank you, Laura.
The unconscious mind is amazing. It can process vastly more information than our conscious mind by using shortcuts based on our background, cultural environment, and personal experiences to make almost instantaneous decisions about everything around us. The snag is, it's wrong quite a lot of the time, especially on matters that need rational thinking. Here's a classic example. A bat and a ball cost £1 10 pence. If the bat costs £1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Most people, including over 50% of students at some of the world's leading universities, get the answer wrong and say 10 pence. The answer is actually 5 pence. Many of us choose 10 pence without thinking. This is because our unconscious mind uses instinct, not analysis. So our unconscious is fallible. It's also biased. It makes snap judgments of people we meet, categorizing them according to gender, social, and other characteristics. In milliseconds, we judge whether somebody is like us and belongs to our in-group. These are the people we favor. So men might favor men, while women might favor women. However, we can belong to different in-groups, and we like to be part of an in-group that's powerful, which could mean a woman favoring a man over a woman. That's unconscious bias. All of us have it, and it colors our decisions without our realizing. For example, research reveals that if I were a man, you would be more likely to be nodding in agreement right now because people pay more attention to a male voice. The Royal Society fosters excellence in science, but this can only be achieved if we select from the widest range of talent. And that's not possible if unconscious bias is narrowing down the field for non-scientific reasons. To lessen the impact of unconscious bias, which is easier for us to notice in others, we are raising the awareness of unconscious bias to members of our selection and appointment panels. We're encouraging panel members to deliberately slow down decision-making, reconsider reasons for decisions, question cultural stereotypes, and monitor each other for unconscious bias. We can't cure unconscious bias, but with self-awareness, we can address it.
All righty. I love this one. Tell me who was like, that's definitely 10 pence. What is this guy talk? What is this woman talking about? Right? I will never forget. Yeah, thanks, Liz. I will never forget the first time I showed this video in a workshop and I had to actually work out the math on the board. Because this person was like, no, this is definitely not 10 pence. It can't be 5. And it was like, until we could actually like slow down, lay out all the facts, write out the formula, have everyone go through the steps of the math, until we were able to do that, there wasn't a full consciousness of like, you know, the whole process there. So actually, Laura, would you mind throwing in the chat the link directly to the Royal Society's website? It's just people looking for the video. Thank you so much. Please link directly to their website because then they won't get all the ads from the YouTube. So this whole idea of how easy it is, right? And the slippery slope of assumption, right? Misinformed or real sort of that intuitively wrong assumptions. This is a normal part of everyday life. Okay, we face this all the time. This is one of the reasons why we have inequality across, many different populations of people. But for business and for our community partners, the most important part about this concept is that it immediately narrows our view of the value of the candidate, right? And so what this does is it puts up this barrier, this roadblock between actually achieving a hire or finding the person we really need, and also recognizing that the most successful organizations around the world actually learn how to hire the most diverse teams and leverage it. So when you have people around you who think differently and look at situations differently and have different perspectives on workflows and potential for innovation, it becomes more possible. I have been part of so many organizations that have grown their ability to hire diverse workers, and now they're differentiating. They're finding their way into markets they never were able to achieve before. People around them are growing personally on the teams about their exposure to different types of ways of life. And this whole idea of unconscious bias is so powerful, and yet I think one of the very interesting things that is an outcome of this project and the summits and the showcases and the training opportunities is that we're actually uncovering really practical ways for employers and community agencies to tackle this, to monitor for bias, right? And to really dive in on how are we as a team or as a collective of employers or community partners, how are we able to create some systems, processes, and tools that actually can impact our openness, right, to receiving difference and to leveraging the power of it, and this is what's so cool about when we can do it, is how much benefit actually comes to the organization, to the community, especially in our small places. We are already great at being excellent neighbors. And so having some new things to explore and different ways of life to experience is only going to enrich our social fabric and also our ability to achieve the business outcomes and the agency outcomes that we are looking for. So what I want to do is point to a couple of the opportunities. But before we get into that, I would like to discuss how critical some of the elements that Stephen went through this morning are with respect to now layering over this new information or improved information about unconscious bias. So Stephen really talked a lot about the fit. Okay. And so one of the traps about fit is that sometimes we can see in the studies of bias, like for example, we know that statistically, women-owned founders, so women-owned businesses, achieve success at venture capitalist funding tables less often than male-led businesses, male-owned businesses. So the researchers asked the question, why? And what they found was that most venture capitalist funders, people meeting with the founder, were male. And so this bias of looking to the applicant to see myself on the other side of the table, okay, to look for what I have seen most often before, in a period of time when women founders weren't the majority and still are not, very much the minority, the more often than not, men were the ones on the other side of the table. And so they did a really neat experiment where they had the same business plan and the same funding requirements, the same credit scores, all those things. And they had a man and a woman go into many different funders and to see what would happen over a repeating period. And in fact, they were able to prove over this massive study that women were not able to access funding as often as men based on the exact same pitch and business plan. And so we have to understand that we have these opportunities within looking for fit. Okay, so I will I will summarize Brene Brown, but this whole concept that the universal truth about people is that everybody wants to belong. Everybody wants to be part of something. They want to be part of a community, part of a family, part of something. Okay. And so belonging is so critical. It's expressed in feeling valued and feeling important and feeling a part of something. But she also deeply expresses in her research that the opposite of belonging is fitting in. And so when we think about that, I question, okay, what's the difference, right? And what she explains in her research is that fitting in requires. Oh, great. Sorry. I'm not sure what happened there, everyone. I'm so sorry. My internet. Welcome to rural Ontario, right? Okay, sorry about that. Everyone can hear me. Laura, you got me back? Okay, sorry about that. Thank you so much. Okay, so essentially, what happens is we have to look at fit from a perspective of values and underlying characteristics of what the vision, the mission of the company is, right? So I remember in Stephen's list there, he had put, Family Man. Okay, so Family Man is a very interesting qualifier to put on that list. And so what I want you to think about right away is think about what we had done there in the Nanny Mommy video to question, what does being a mom look like? Right? What does that look like? What were her physical behaviors? What were the things that the body language she was doing, the way she was positioned in the room, all of those things. This is super personal, how you interpret Family Man, right? That whole idea of what a family man means is very wide ranging, right? That can mean something totally different for me compared to what it means to you, and based on what you've experienced and seen in the world and what you were told. And so right away, we can look well beyond that qualifier of Family Man and actually really look at, what does that mean to me? Describe that for me, right? Look at that carefully. And so when I think about Family Man, okay, and these are just my personal life experience opinions on it, is I would think about someone who prioritizes his family, right, first and foremost, and someone who intentionally spends time with his family. Okay, so some people might interpret that as the breadwinner, right? The person who is bringing home the resources so that the family can be sustained and thrive. Okay, maybe this for someone will mean just someone who loves their kids unconditionally or loves their wife unconditionally. So I want you to really think about some of the language behind, or the nuance behind, the identifiers in your qualifications and in your listings, right? I think so much about, so one of the sort of secret hidden, not hidden identities of me, but one of the things that I work on a lot is competitive swimming. I've been a coach with competitive swimming for longer than I would want to quote here, but since I was about 11 years old. And so I have been involved in athlete development from sort of bubble blowing right up to national podiums and world stages. And so one of the things that we talk about a lot in sport is sort of this whole idea around whether or not, one body type, let's call it, right? Or one way of being in the way that we compete or the way that we race. But the way that this shows up the most for me is when I'm hiring and training new swimming coaches. Okay, so we have a stream in our club where if you're not maybe into competing so much, you can flip to an employment track, okay, to develop as a leader and as a child connector. So when I think about who I'm hiring for that type of, youth mentorship role, I actually don't care a stitch whether or not they know the technical jargon of competitive swimming. I don't care 1 ounce whether they know what is the best time for a 13-year-old to be swimming at, a female 13-year-old in Ontario. I don't care about any of those technical pieces. What I care about is whether or not that person is naturally gifted at connecting with younger people, with younger swimmers, with young kids, right? Who's going to be loving and mentor. And so that characteristic is absolutely based on who they are at the core, what they value, how they treat others, and I can train the technical skills, right? So when we're talking about fit, it's absolutely critical that we do not replace fit with clones of everyone else, okay, or of myself. And this is actually the biggest trap that recruiters get into, is that we get into, or HR people or people who are actually the front line of hiring, is we start to get into this mode of like, oh, I'm just trying to replace this amazing person that I had the chance to work with. I'm looking for their clone. I'm looking for my clone, right? Because I prefer the way that I do work and the way that I approach things and the way that I look at things, because I'm naturally designed to do that. Okay, so there's nothing to be blamed about that thinking. It's just that it's not enough, right? We know that we have to start thinking about different candidates. We know that we have to be more open, because if we're still looking for that same singular type of candidate in characteristics that don't actually matter to the job, we're just going to continue to experience those zeros on the job applications, you know, of what's actually translating. So radical openness to the way that people are and live and work is really important. But one of the things that I always say after that sentence is that I also recognize that business models have hard parameters around credentials or around types of work, shift work, for example. You know, there are a lot of healthcare providers on this call, and I know that that deeply involves you know, longer shifts or regular like night work, these kinds of things. So the business model itself may be sort of presenting some hard lines on what we must expect, right? Like credentials in certain fields and these kinds of things. But one of the places we can go right away to open up in inclusion at work is to examine the validity of what's on that list. So when I looked at the big list there that Stephen put up, I would immediately start looking at whether those pieces on the list of the things I expect in the candidate, are they valid? Okay, have they been tested for validity? Okay, so that whole idea, thank you for saying that about referrals, Deborah. That's a really important thing, is that people often refer people that are just like them, right? And that's all part of it. That's why we hire family and all sorts of different things happen in our world. But I think it's really important to examine the validity behind the thing on the page of the job ad. Okay, so when we take a look at these things, the questions I would want you to ask yourself are, does this really matter to the work performance? Right? Does this really matter to the ability for people to do the job well? Okay. And so when I think about this, I right away think about some of the struggles I've heard about people, newcomers or others who have experience, but maybe not the right number of years in university or the degree or the master's degree or whatever that is. Okay, so they might have the experience, but they do not have the credential. Maybe they have a foreign credential, right, that we don't understand or necessarily know how to debunk. Okay, yeah, 5 years experience. Why, right? Why is 5 years experience important? I remember this quote, and I'm probably going to botch it, but there's a quote that's something like, 5 years experience, there's a very big difference between repeating the same thing you did year one over and over and over again, or growing quickly through a role and developing, right? So it's not about time served, it's what have you learned? What did you do to grow, right? And then I think about things like interview questions. So after I validated all the parameters of the job requirements, then I start looking at the language in it. You know, one of the things that, and language is powerful across the board, people. One of the great things that Stephen had put up there was a job ad that said ability to work autonomously. What grade level language is autonomous? That word autonomous, okay? That needs to be examined. Does that word and that language fit with the potential literacy of that candidate, right? Or the vocabulary stretch of that candidate. So I would immediately be looking at language, right? I loved the Trader Joe's ad because it was very like casually written. Like, I think it's so fun to watch some of the cool job titles that come out here, like client wrangler and like things like that. But the idea of that language, client wrangler, that's something that's going to appeal to a very specific candidate who's fun, approachable, right? Looking in at, but yet is someone who comes from a culturally different place or background might look at that and go, what does that mean? You know? But language is really, really powerful. And so I would recommend that we then look at some of the words that we've chosen and the way that it's described, you know, and the videos are so powerful if we can put the job ad into a video, right? I'll never forget working with this amazing sponsorship group of Syrian refugees. And actually, Sherry Harris from one of our local employment agencies did an awesome interview about this, where she said that one of the key features of the placement for this man was learning through watching, right? That in fact, he wasn't necessarily comfortable with the language, with English language speaking and listening, but the trainer was able to offer observation, right? Observed training opportunities and coaching through tactile observation. And so that was put right in, you know, that was put right into the get-go of the hire, that we will offer this kind of, you know, visual-based training to help deal with that, right? And so when I think about that, it moves me to the next thing that I like to examine, which is the interview questions and the interview setting. Okay, so the first thing I always look at for inclusion in an interview setting is, what's the room like? Does it simulate, you know, the whole idea of what they're going to face in the job environment? Right? Like I remember teaching a college marketing class, and they were an automotive program, and I wanted them to understand about customer service at a service desk, you know, like in a dealer or in a garage, when you're standing behind, you know, a service desk and you're speaking to the client and there's a challenge. So I gave them a project of kind of a challenge with a customer, something, a part didn't come in, whatever. And they had to simulate and get right in there and deal with me as the tough customer, requiring them to help me and fix the problem. And we talked about the use of space first, right? How is the setting reflective of what I would actually be facing in that situation? So we got a counter and we got it to look like the same as a typical garage. We had them use words and language that came naturally to them, instead of interviewing in a panel format with, you know, 5 intimidating people in suits on the other side of a table and me walking in there going, oh my goodness, right? So making sure that your setting reflects the validity of the job and the importance of the job. But even more is about the language and the types of questions that you ask. So a really great example is one of the very first questions that often is asked in a Canadian workplace interview is, tell me about yourself and your life, okay? So when we think about the interpretation of that particular question, what the tool I like to use here is called individual versus collectivist society. Okay, so there's this polarity or these two spectrums where there's this individualistic culture and a collective culture. Okay, and there's a sliding bead between the two in the way that we live and operate in those two things. So, for example, and these are broad brushstrokes, but for example, in Canada, we do belong to despite being, sort of socialist in the way that we support our communities with healthcare and that, we do have an individualist culture in work. It's about titles, eyes, and credentials, education. I accomplished this. I have this title. I've done this. And this is the expectation. And in fact, I would suggest that many of our partners in Employment Ontario could relate to how we coach candidates. And I've been part of this world for a long time and deeply understand that reflecting your own accomplishments and referring to how you look at work and do work is critical in an interview. Okay. But then we would look at someone who might be from a collective society or collective culture background, where this answer might reflect more the family. Tell me about yourself. Right? It might be more about the community that they grew up in or who was around them. And instead of referring to individual accomplishments or titles, they might only speak about personal family things. Okay. And this is very generalized, but what I'm trying to paint the picture of here is that the question, tell me about yourself, if you had scored this based on listing accomplishments and work experience, and someone spent the entire time answering that question reflecting their personal life, they might get a 0 on that, right? And so you might want to probe a clarifying question, but even better is to reframe it from the beginning as to what you're actually looking for specifically, right? To be very specific and clear about what it is you're trying to understand. Right? So if you ask the question, tell me about yourself, you could reframe this in the sense of, tell me about your last position, right? Tell me about the last 3 jobs, the evolution of your career over the last 3 years, something like that. Okay. So we want to be really specific about what it is that we are putting in the language of our interview questions and whether or not that is culturally appropriate. I was thinking about, there was some critique about the EQAO testing, the school board testing, the ministry testing questions. And there was I believe it's grade 6, and I am so sorry, I'm not involved in the education sector enough to know this, and I don't have children, but this grade 6 test, from my understanding, had a question in it that said, if I was a newcomer if I was around a newcomer student and could take them anywhere in Canada to showcase my country, where would I take them? And how is a child who is a newcomer to Canada or new to Canada in any way going to answer that? Right? So it's like, if I'm only been here in the GTA for a certain amount of time, or maybe I haven't had the privilege of traveling within Canada as a family, how am I going to answer that question? Right? And how will I be graded on that? So there's a million different ways to look at a cultural appropriateness within interview questions, but it's kind of just about doing the work of looking at it, and questioning this. Because I think so often we're so inundated with busy, keeping the lights on. The pandemic has deeply affected employers, and doing more and thinking about adding more seems daunting, I'm sure. But I find that there's an opportunity here to really start to think about the proactive elements that we can do that feed the sort of strategies and outcomes that Stephen referred to this morning. This entire idea about all of the concepts that Stephen went through are absolutely correct and absolutely true. But what is also absolutely true is that every single one of those tactics that he described has a moment for a bias monitor, has a moment for cultural inclusion, has a moment for working with individuals with a disability. receiving LGBTQ or trans employees, right? All of these issues around difference, okay? And what I mean by that is that difference is not bad. Difference is actually one of the biggest competitive advantages. And when Stephen was talking about differentiation, being the local employer that is the most inclusive is going to be a competitive advantage as well. Okay. And not just about having the right talent and keeping them, but also demonstrating that you are willing to work with people who have different ways of working, thinking, and living, and that you have structures in place to embrace that and leverage it. Okay. And this, I love these comments coming in here. And thank you so much for Shelley to respond there. Working with people with disabilities. So there's an incredible program with the United Way called EARN. And it's an employer coaching program about how to really understand the real realities of accommodation and what might be required. And it seems so daunting at times to want to think about accommodating an employee with a disability. But in fact, the goal of this organization and project is to be able to showcase that it's actually quite affordable and doable in many, many situations, you know? So thank you so much for asking that question, Shelley. So how do we do this if we haven't been part of a culture of difference or been a newcomer into a small town? How are we going to do this, right? How are we going to build these systems? And this afternoon, we're going to be going over some pretty cool stuff. But one of the really neat things that I always think about is, first of all, I reflect on self. Okay. So I had this really interesting opportunity when I was training as a coach last year in sport. I attended a Northern Ontario summit for coaching where there were 18 different sports in the room, 50 communities represented. And one of the keynotes was actually the chief technical officer for PGA Golf. And he is also a diversity and inclusion specialist in sport as a gay male going up through baseball. And so he gave us this incredible talk about inclusion in sport and what the world is facing there. And one of the exercises that he did with us was this really cool diversity inventory chart. Okay, so what you can do it right now with me live in just your mind. So think about if you were on the road and you got a flat tire, okay, and you were alone and you needed to call someone to help you. And I'm not talking about a tow, a friend, or someone in your tight circle. Who would you call that is not your family? So it can't be your spouse or your kids or anyone in your immediate family. Who would you call, right? So you think about 5 people that you might have, you know, on the old speed dial that you might call to help rescue you. Okay, so when I thought about that, okay, it was pretty easy. I wrote down 5 initials of people that I would call. And then he had us kind of uncover the rest of the page of the exercise. And it was a chart. And they asked us to fill out the chart and answer some qualifiers about who these people are. What language do they speak? What's the education level? What's the income level? What's the skin color? What's the country of origin? There was all these different qualifiers, right? The gender identity, you know, sexual identity, these kinds of things all went into breaking out the person's identifiers, essentially, okay? And what I learned right away when I did that was that all 5 of the people on my list were women in their 30s who make more than $75,000 a year and live in small towns with a car. Right? So right away, I can recognize that the people around me and the stories I hear and the experiences that I'm a part of and the social circles that I belong to are quite homogenous. Right? So right away, I know, and this is not wrong, this is likely in a small town that we have sort of a more dominance of or presence of a normative representation of me. Okay, this is normal. However, it's a self-check moment for me, right? It's a moment for me to say, okay, why is that? Why has that happened? Do I need to spend more time hanging out in different places with different types of people and different groups? Where am I volunteering? You know, where am I making friends? those kinds of questions start to really look at me and what am I doing to broaden my lens. And then we can also look at things like, do I take other people's lived experiences at face value? This is a really interesting part of what we do at the Community Settlement Initiative, which is training people and teaching people about sort of the idea of snowflake or gaslighting, right? That your experience can't be real because I haven't lived it, or I can't imagine that life, or whatever it is. So it's really interesting when we do this self-reflection. What am I exposed to? What was the narrative at my dinner table? Did I have a dinner table growing up? What kind of teachers did I have? What messages do I absorb from the media and repeat out of my mouth? What are the things that I do to contribute to my own narrowness or broadness of view of the world? Okay. But the underlying reality of that first phase of action, which is for self, is that we can only look upon the world through a lens that has been lived, right? So I cannot live my life as a trans woman of color. I am not going to be able to live that life. And so I cannot understand what that might feel like in the candidate market for someone like that, for someone with those identifiers, okay, or personal identifiers. So I think it's important that we think about ourselves and where we're playing in the community and what we're doing to learn and grow and expose ourselves to different ways of living and what's actually happening outside of our bubble, our circle. And then there's sort of the second part, which is to make sure that we look at what's immediately around us, resources, people, lenses that are available to us now that we could gather and organize, right? So I often think about this as a bias monitoring system. So, how do I include the right, the sort of the best possible lens or experience onto the monitoring table or through the process? Who should review this? Who needs to look at this? Right? So when I think about that, I think about ground level people, right? So people on the front lines who are experiencing things, day to day, daily interactions, they should be included. People with difference from lived experience, country of origin, language, first language, any person that can represent the LGBTQ lens, indigenous populations, all sorts of people that have had diverse experiences should be part of the processes that we use to filter through our communications, our interview questions, our policies, so that we have this sense of what can we identify that I can't see, right? That I'm limited to see because of my lived experience, which carries no blame or judgment. It's just that I need to know. I need to be involving other people. And so I need help to be able to do that. And that's where collaboration, peers, working with peers, other agencies, even in the healthcare sector, I see a huge opportunity for long-term care centers and other hospital facilities to come together on developing one process in the sector that we can all live and, sort of die by. All of those things are possible when we recruit and gather the right people at the right time. I also know that we can start to set up policies, systems, and structures at the organizational level that require this, right? So we had this huge conversation with the team yesterday. We were wrapping up a conference, an immigration conference, that spoke about the power of, the right thinking is great, but it also must be backed up by the power structure. Okay, so I interviewed one time this amazing woman who is an equity, diversity, and inclusion person. So she told me this story about how in her organization, she knew she was producing the right policies, helping them to write the right documents, helping them to redevelop their interview questions, all of these things. She had the tools, she had the knowledge. But because her position as a manager was 4 steps from the executive decision-making table, there was no commitment follow through on inclusion. There wasn't a mandate at the executive team level. There wasn't a vice president of equity, diversity, and inclusion. There was no mandate that every single decision, policy, communication tool, or whatever they developed, whatever decision they made, had an inclusion lens brought forward on it, right? So she knew right away that although her impact was going to be good at a granular level, to create full system change through the organization requires to put this kind of thinking and action at a mandate level, at a compliance level almost, so that the monitoring is a must-have, not a nice-to-have. And I think that's a really, really big distinction about how are we going to, as a community of employers and agencies, support each other to develop these things, right? Because as a solo, like I'm a small biz, I have 10 or less employees. And basically, we're talking about how am I going to do all of that with just me or just me and a small team of people supporting my hiring? You know, how am I going to do that alone? Right. And so the goal of this summit, and especially what we're going to go through this afternoon, is to figure out what we need to do together and what we need to do with further supports and what we need to do, what could we do on our own. Right. And so the idea behind this whole project and what Shelley and her team are trying to pull off is these concrete realities of, yep, we're in, we're buying in, we get that we need to do this as an organization, as a region, we're committed to being inclusive. We know the power of diverse workforces, but how will we deliver on it? And how can we do it together so that there's less burden on the individual level and more collaboration and more sharing so that we can actually become together this group that monitors the entire region of outcomes and the inclusional practices. Okay, so before I let you go for break, I want to take you through one last exercise that is a direct example of how we might do this. Okay, so I hope you're ready. It's super fun. You can use the chat to answer my questions. And then there were only 2 questions. And in fact, the second question is answered the opposite of the first. So let me just pop open here, make sure I've got my little image rocking here. And there it is. All right, popping into the screen share so you guys can check out this ad, which is a local community ad for a neat community event called Light Up the Night. You might have seen this around your own community. But what I want you don't even have to read everything on here, but essentially what this is a PDF download from a local municipality here in Renfrew County, who I love dearly, by the way, and this is not a judgment exercise, but just an example. But here is an ad for a really neat traditional Christmas display and best Christmas display contest for lit community sort of home-based decorations. Okay, everybody got a chance to see that? All right, so the question I have for you is, who is included in this community initiative? Go ahead and pop it in the chat. Who is included? Who would see this and go, bingo, me? Christians. Christians, those who celebrate Christmas. Businesses, homeowners, businesses again, only those who celebrate and understand what Christmas is, people who celebrate Christmas, everyone, those who celebrate Christmas, people who light up their homes and businesses, Christians. Okay, businesses whose clients celebrate Christmas, excellent. Motivated people, Christmas maybe, but others who are trying to fit in, thank you. Disposable income, those who celebrate Christmas, those who have a box of lights in their basement already. Oh, wow. Okay, you guys are getting what I'm putting down here, okay? So there are a few other things too that are included in here. You probably already have to have the resources of the lights or the money to buy them. You also have to be able to handle, even if you have LEDs, you might have an increased hydro bill. You have to have home and land. You also have to have literacy to read the ad. You have to have access to the internet because all of these ads are available online. You also have to know to go to those distribution channels. You have to be okay with your name being publicized. You have to be okay with being judged or understand what competing is. You have to use electricity. So if you are from a Mennonite population or someone who's off grid, you are not participating. Right? So you can see where we're going on and on here. Disposable income's a huge feature here. Land ownership, public display, right? Literacy didn't even cross my mind, right? So when we think it like, this is right. And so it's true that you don't have to enter, that you don't have to sort of participate. But the interesting point here that we're making is that not everyone can if they wanted to. Okay, so that's the really important, so right, have to have a home. Thank you so much. And so one of the most important things to recognize, people, is that when we examine the author of this program or of this initiative, we would expect that these features would be there, of course, right? There is a huge conversation going on in the community about sort of these accommodations that we're making for COVID around Christmas, like in Quebec, but not during Ramadan and not during other types of holidays, right? So this is happening because the majority of people in the province celebrate Christmas or take a holiday at that time, okay? And so they're going based on the norms or the averages or the majorities, okay? Which is what we just talked about, is like the power of the majority, right? And that's fine. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with celebrating Christmas and prioritizing that. Nothing wrong with that. It's that if we want it to be inclusive and a true community development event, we have the opportunity to open and broaden it, right? We had some suggestions come forward that they could add a bows and bows version of it to remove the light component. You even, use, if you had trees around the land, you could use the free resources around you. There could be a collaborative group where you can just decorate a wild tree in a park with bows and different things to come together as maybe in a apartment complex to do that. There's a whole bunch of really creative ideas that came forward that do not delete the importance of having a community celebration around the Christmas holiday. This is great. We're not trying to not say Merry Christmas, or to take away that cultural importance for so many Canadians and so many local people that I know and love. But it's also who else? How can we even do more than that, right? And so what's possible, like I remember someone talking about a lights drop-off box, right? A donation box where you could just swing by and grab a few strings out of the box if you weren't able to afford it, right? So right away, we can see how adding things like features to the program that even move inclusion forward a couple steps, it helps people in the community to feel that they belong, that they are valued for the way that, despite the way they live or for the way that they live, and that any alternatives to the norm are totally cool and in fact accepted, and that we want to see, and we want to see how people might interpret this contest for themselves, right? And so really, really cool opportunities. It's sometimes about, stepping away from the norms and stepping into a little bit of discomfort, a little bit of not sure how to get this right, and trying anyway, because I think the big difference between what separates excellent employers from average employers is intention, is intentionally looking at and setting aside time to be proactive on how we can get the results we really want to get with the proactive approaches to monitoring bias and slowing down and challenging our assumptions throughout the process. Thank you so much for listening and participating. I hope this was a little teaser for you to think about more. This afternoon, we're going to dive into some really cool work together in some breakout rooms. And I genuinely encourage anyone to reach out to us. Laura and I can be found at the Community Settlement Initiative webpage through Algonquin College, which I know someone will throw in the chat. But we also are wrapping our project up in March. So if you want to be part of the free training service data collection, please let us know. We can do a presentation with your organization, work with you one-on-one, or whatever you might want to do together. It's all free until the end of March. So please get together with us, and we so welcome you. Thank you so much for this.